But we're going to be talking about the Domesday Book, which I'm actually very excited to talk about, and I'm glad to be featuring in the episode because I was going to watch it anyway, so I'm looking forward to hearing about it.
Cool, yeah, this is like a little bit of an extra one on top of the series we did on William the Conqueror, because obviously we'll be moving on after his death, which we talked about in the last one, but I did want to spend a bit of time on Domesday Book, because it is really, really important, I think, well, if you're an Englishman, certainly. People have said that the two greatest documents in our history are the Magna Carta and Domesday, but for very different reasons, really. Very, very different reasons. And you can make the argument that Domesday is more pivotal. Well, a couple of historians I've been reading have made that exact argument. Because it's unparalleled. There's nothing like it in the whole world. I mentioned in the last one as well. There's really nothing like it. And in fact, depending on what kind of argument you want to make, you could say it wasn't until the 19th century that anything rivaled it. Some said there's other things in Europe a bit earlier, but still, it's just so far ahead of its time. I mean, nearly 1,000 years old. Incredible. And, which is truly incredible in my opinion, it actually physically still survives.
I know, that does always surprise me. I've seen, get screenshots of some of the pages, and they're quite good condition, really, aren't they?
Considering.
Yeah.
Because usually it's one of the things, almost a trope in history or in archaeology or in archivism. Paper doesn't survive very long. I mean, in the ancient world, lots of things are written on papyrus. Unless you're lucky, really, they don't survive. They perish. Given enough time, any sort of damp or humidity or any sort of things just don't survive on paper or papyrus.
Well, it's a
usually
biodegradable material, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. So the fact that it's not only survived, but in relatively good nick, almost 1,000 years later, it's remarkable. The first thing I think I need to say is that there's the Domesday Survey and the Domesday Book, which are different things. So the Domesday Book, which survives in our archives, is exactly that, a book. In fact, there's more than one. There's Great Domesday, the main volume, and there's Little Domesday, which chronicles things more in the east of England. And then there's various other, what they call small satellite books. But to all intents and purposes, it's sort of one book. So that was compiled after they did the survey. So what a lot of people think of the Domesday Book is actually really the Domesday Survey, which they did incredibly quickly, and I'll get into the detail of that in a moment. Did incredibly quickly, in something like 6 months, maybe a bit more, but super quick, almost unbelievably quickly. But it took another probably couple of years for them to compile all that information into the Domesday Book. Okay, so I'll talk about that again in more detail in a bit, but that's something to realise. They didn't just go out, collect all this information, and then within that ridiculously short window of time, make the Domesday Book. That took longer. So a couple of times I'll probably have to say, make a distinction between the original survey and the subsequent book.
I didn't know the difference between the two. I presumed that it was all part of the same thing, really.
And a couple other things just to add to the complexity of it a bit is that at the same time, i.e. in the 1080s, sorry to put it in its context, this is the 1080s, at the very, very end of William the Conqueror's reign and life, they also did some sort of review of all the taxes of gelds. And the relationship between Domesday Book and that isn't 100% clear, but that also happened, which just makes it a tiny bit more complicated as well. And in the Victorian period, as quite often happens in history, someone will come up with, a particular historian will come up with a view, a reading of the history, and people just won't question that for ages. It's human nature, really, isn't it? I mean, in all sorts of things that happens, doesn't it? In science even, like Aristotle said something, people just carry on believing that for 2,000 years.
It's sort of paradigm defining, isn't it? That particularly when it's someone who's got a certain amount of esteem, well, people don't want to necessarily go against them and quite often take them at their word.
Yeah. Well, like, the thing that nearly always springs to mind when we talk about this sort of thing is that idea of phlogiston. You know that in science, where they thought there was a certain type of miasma in the air. It's just nonsense to us. With a truly scientific method, just it isn't correct. But people thought that and continued thinking it for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years.
Is that like the bad air?
Right, exactly.
Theory, yeah.
Yeah. So, okay, let's get into it. I've got a quote here from a historian, Thomas Hyde, who wrote a great book all about the Domesday Book. I think sets things up quite well. He wrote, it's a fairly long quote, but he wrote this. There's nothing quite like Domesday Book. Indeed, there is nothing remotely like it. This much historians agree about. There is no comparable 900-year-old infantry of a complete country, village by village, manor by manor. What is more, the book itself survives, preserved for centuries at Winchester, capital of the ancient Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Wessex, now held in London at the Public Records Office. The irony is that something so well known has remained until recently, in every sense, a closed book, except to a handful of medieval scholars. The most obvious reason for this is that Domesday is not merely written in Latin, but in a highly abbreviated version of Latin. Another is that, even in translation, it describes a world that is so strange to us today that we need to be guided through its technicalities. A world in which bishops were earls and earls were bishops, in which rents might be paid in sticks of eels or cestas of honey, in which the pig, fattened on acorns, was by far the most important domestic animal, in which the south of the country was so prosperous that the king could collect his dues in the ancient way by settling his court on a manor and living off of it, while parts of the north had been so severely devastated by William's scorched earth policy that a quarter of some counties was still waste, inverted commas. So that's one thing that comes up a lot, is waste. They just mention, yeah, like I said, whole swathes sometimes of the country. It's just jotted down as waste.
Imagine that's a consequence of warfare, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it is incredible that we have such a detailed view, really. So it's a snapshot, sort of an incredible snapshot of our.
I know it
early
is.
history.
It's quite impressive, really, that there's a source so old that is so comprehensive, really, because despite the abbreviations and the difficulties in actually understanding what the Domesday Book says, I imagine it's a great boon to a historian to have just this massive document, I suppose, where you actually get a proper measure, if once you've understood it enough, of what it was like to live in England at that time, which is no small thing, really, is it?
Yeah,
As far as primary sources go.
Yeah, absolutely. As a primary source, it is. Oh, it's the creme de la creme, really. You couldn't ask for much more. But just a quick note then to say on the abbreviation thing, when you look at actual entries, or usually, well, for me, I don't have much Latin, the English translations of these entries, it doesn't make any real sense. You can't just read it and it makes sense to you. You have to know exactly what they meant by every tiny abbreviation.
When I tried to understand it, I know bits and pieces of Latin, not a whole lot. I certainly wasn't private schooled, so never studied it at school or anything. But yeah, I couldn't make heads or tails of it. It didn't resemble any Latin that I really had any knowledge of.
You know, but they'll, I mean, even beyond that, they'll just like put the letter A and then a number. So unless you're specifically told what that means, you would never be able to fathom it particularly. And the Latin they used is not the same as the Latin you'd probably get taught today, because I say I haven't got much Latin, but I've got some. At undergrad, even though I didn't go to public school, I did have to do a course in Latin in my first year, and it was sort of GCSE level, because they still teach GCSE Latin in some schools, believe it or not. You know, you start at 11 years old, and me and a handful of poor kids were made to do that course. But even that's sort of the Hanoverian version of Latin, so a much, much, much later version of Latin. It wouldn't be the same Latin that Domesday was written in. It was not really the same Latin that they spoke in classical Rome. It's a more modern version of it. So anyway, a relatively normal person like you or I would have no hope of reading the original Domesday Book. So, but luckily, historians have pored over it almost endlessly. The Victorians were fascinated by it. In fact, there's a historian, Maitland, I believe his name was, Victorian historian, who he's one of those guys who had all his opinions about Domesday out there, and people just didn't question it for generations. And it's only in the last, well, since the 70s, 1970s really, much more scholarship has been done on it, and they've decided that Maitland was incorrect about all sorts of things.
It's quite often the case, isn't it, where you have particularly in the Victorian era, I know it happens in psychology, whereby someone says something and then it becomes the dominant paradigm for even 100 years later. And I think that part of that reason is because of the fact that quite often they were sort of pioneers in their craft in a way, in that there wasn't too much of an academic interest in certain things, and they kind of defined the route to modernity in some way, which is probably why they weren't questioned as much, because they were the only person who really had an opinion on it in the first place. You've got to be able to challenge it, haven't you? And it's very difficult to do if you've only got one opinion on the matter.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. Like a historian, a Victorian historian, say does a really almost a lifetime of research. I'm thinking of someone like Theodore Mompson, and well, to rival them or to confidently say they're wrong about something. Well, you kind of have to do a lifetime of research as well, right?
It's no small thing.
Right? Yeah. So if I could read another line here, a very famous line from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the E version of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. If you ever read a book or watch a decent lecture or something about the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they'll almost certainly quote this, because it's just perfect. It's because the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle quite often just omits lots and lots of things. Like years we know loads of events went down, it says hardly anything. So when we do get a decent chunk of a paragraph explaining something, that's gold dust in and of itself. And we've got one on the Domesday Book. So I shall read it. The E-Chronicle said this. He, William the Conqueror, he had much thought and deep discussion with his council about the country, how it was occupied and with what sort of people. Then he sent his men over all England into every shire and had them find out how many hundred hides of land there were in the shire, and what land and cattle the king himself had in the country, or what dues he ought to have in 12 months from the shire. Also, he had a record made of how much land his archbishops had, and his bishops and abbots, and his earls. And though I relate it at too great a length, what or how much everybody had who occupied the land in England, in land and cattle, and how much money it was worth, so very narrowly did he have it investigated, that there was no single hide, nor yard of land, nor indeed, it is a shame to relate, but it seemed no shame to him to do so, one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig was left out, and not put down in his record. And here's sort of the very famous line. And all these records were brought to him afterwards, end quote. And I'll explain why that's so important, that last line there. But so there you go. That's the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. So that's monks that were alive at the time. So again, you can't ask for much
better than that. Yeah,
can't ask for much more than that. I could quote Churchill or Oman or something, but if we've got the actual Chronicle, why not? So a little overview on just some numbers. It's mainly in two books, as I said, Great Domesday and Little Domesday, as well as the satellites. It's something in the order of 832 folios, 2 million odd words. And it talks about something like 13,000 different settlements in England at the time, which relates to something like 30,000 different manors or big houses, should we say.
It's an amazing sort of logistical feat, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It just that it could be done at that time with that level of technology. It's very, very impressive. I know it was done out of necessity, I imagine, but...
Yeah. Well, historians argue about that.
Okay.
What was it for exactly? Because, like I say, the Victorians would just say, well, it's a tax record. It's a record of incomes and revenues and gelds. And now we think, well, it's in part that, or may have been used for something like that, but it's not entirely that. And I'll get into why we think that in a moment. Just say it looks like something in the order of £73,000 in revenues per year could be generated from the holdings we find in Great Domesday. So we know something like 17% of all the land was owned directly by the king. Something in the order of 26% was owned by the church. So again, quite different to subsequent centuries. Mark Morris, a modern historian, said, quote, "It is without question the most important document in English history, unparalleled in its volume and scope." Not wrong.
No, that seems pretty uncontroversial to me.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.